Welcome back to the Personal Finance Project. We're joined yet again by Greg Ashcroft and Scott Bartosh. It has been a while since I introduced the two of them, so if you're a new listener, Greg is a chartered financial analyst, a certified financial planner, has a master's degree in personal financial planning, and is a director with the Ashcroft-Pesic-Bartosh Group. Greg has worked in the industry for 9 years. Scott is a certified financial planner and has a master's degree in personal financial planning and is a director with the Ashcroft-Pesic-Bartosh Group. Scott has worked as a financial advisor for over a decade. As many of you know, our podcast is usually geared towards those nearing retirement or currently retired. However, today we're going to be speaking to our younger listeners by covering common financial pitfalls in your 20s. Preparing for retirement doesn't begin in your 50s, and avoiding mistakes early pays dividends far into the future. To kick things off, Scott, what is the biggest mistake you made in your 20s?
Well, I would say the first one was graduating from college into the financial crisis. That was kind of challenging. I didn't have a whole lot to do with that one. But in all seriousness, I have become, as I've gotten a little bit older, and this is, guy in his late 30s talking to maybe people in their early 20s or late teens even, is there's a lot that's said in kind of the popular media these days about, you've really got to lean into like STEM or business or something like that to be successful. And if I could go back and do it again, I would say I don't think you necessarily have to be in the exact right field, but for getting that very, very first job out of college, having really good grades and a couple of professors that think you really know what you're doing, that is so important for that maybe very first job out of college. So like having that 3.8 in college versus the 3.2 or maybe a little bit worse than that, I think that could make a huge difference if you're trying to get a competitive job, more so than, let's say, being an engineering major with a little bit lower GPA. So I would say, not to scare you, but this starts really early. And I think the earlier in the cycle of life you realize that you're in a competitive world, the better. So that'd be maybe the first thought.
No, I think that's great, because I think one of the things people learn when they leave the environment of college and they get out into the working world is that the real value of their education is going to be made, I think, most salient on the job. But I think it doesn't really matter what job you get, just that you get a job.
Yeah.
And you start actually accruing valuable work experience so that you can start to understand how things actually work. And your preconceptions about certain jobs, they might be totally off base. And so you might come to discover that you were really considering maybe going on and getting an MBA, maybe going on and getting a law degree, or maybe even going on to medical school, only to discover now that you've had a job and you really had an opportunity to see how that work is done, that you all of a sudden don't want to pursue those fields any longer. Where the thought of being a family physician making, $170,000, $180,000 a year, but spending most of your time grappling with insurance companies and filling out electronic medical records, like that doesn't appeal to you at all.
Yeah, in all of your 20s and early 30s going to school in some form or fashion.
And not to mention, I think on top of that is the debt spiral that you can get into if you have some uncertainty about the direction you want to go with your life, because schools are very eager to give out student loans. They are super eager to give out student loans. And we've encountered many people who are just they're just struggling underneath the weight of this student debt. And it could have even been accrued in a field they have no interest in pursuing any longer.
Yeah, and this is a big pet peeve of mine if we kind of look back at the way that student loans and college has been advertised to people over the last, say, 20 years, more so than before that, is if you're going to take out a whole lot of loans, there has to be something on the other side to help you make enough money to pay those off. So, I mean, it's great to go to college and be a teacher, but to take, a couple $100,000 of debt to do that. Okay, one thing being aside, maybe there's a student loan repayment plan with the place that you're going to work, something like that. But just be cognizant that, hey, if I'm going to take these loans, I need to pay these back. And even the super backup plan, student loan debt is not dischargeable in bankruptcy in most cases.
It's not.
So you really are not getting out of this.
No, it's one of those things where you have to be absolutely sure. And I think, because I want to be cautious here in knowing that taking advice when you're in your 20s, or maybe even now when I'm in my early 30s, it's kind of difficult because you feel like you have a really good idea of what it is that you want to do. So I think the overarching point there would be go a little bit slower. I think the Brookings Institute did a study as in the polynomial, equation of what would give a person financial independence or freedom. It was very simple. Graduate high school and get a job. That's pretty much what they found, was if you are a high school graduate and you get a job, you are well on your way to financial independence. And I feel like lately what's been really in vogue is there's absolutely no jobs for people who don't have a master's degree or who don't have a PhD or don't have some advanced degree. And it's like, maybe in very specific fields that would be the case. Obviously, you're not going to be a medical doctor if you just have a high school diploma, but graduating high school, and I think this is something that my wife and I have discussed about our kids, is bringing back the gap year where a person doesn't immediately go off to college under some assumption or illusion that they know exactly what it is they want to study for the next 4 years and exactly what they want to do with the rest of their life when they might be 17 or 18 years old. Go out, get a service job, interact with real human beings in the real world, figure out how they work, figure out a little bit about how small or large corporations are actually run, and that will probably put you on a better path toward making sure all of the money that you spend on your education is actually spent on something you might be good at or that you might have an interest in.
That ties really nicely to my very first point, which was the kind of competitiveness of career, job market, all of those types of things. It really does start as soon as you're in college, and not many freshmen, I know I didn't realize that. And so I would say that if you did something like that, take a gap year, and it helps you to understand, okay, this is now the adult part of my life, that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, and obviously, if you have the familial support or the social safety net to do so, because a lot of people might say, well, I had to get the student loans because I had to go to college because I was ultimately going to want to make a lot of money. It's like I could totally appreciate how if you can't live either very cheaply with some roommates or stay at home to live for your gap year while you're working a service job, that might not seem like an option to you. But I guess I would still explore maybe getting some real world experience ahead of just diving headlong into a bunch of student debt.
Yeah, I think and another good point on that is not everybody who eventually gets a master's or a law degree or an MBA does that right after their bachelor's degree. Right. And I think in a lot of cases, it's advisable to maybe not run those two things right together. Yeah. To go out into the world, get a job, like you said, doesn't really matter what, and then make a decision where you want to go from there.
Yeah.
Another thing, I think, say you have an idea of where you want to be, but you don't know how to get there, talk to somebody who's in that position. So people on LinkedIn occasionally will send me a note on, how the heck did you end up there? Because it seems pretty unlikely, frankly. But
who would have thought?
Yeah, who would have thought? Not me.
Not me.
So find somebody who's in a position that you like or you aspire to be in and ask them how it worked for them. And I'd say 9 out of 10 times, they'll probably tell you.
Yeah. I mean, Daniel Gilbert, he wrote this wonderful book called Stumbling on Happiness. And that was one of the points that he made was like, you have all of these really great, what he called surrogates that are available. And if you just send a cold email to a person who did what you wanted to do, who went to the law school you're considering, who's a practicing lawyer, ask them about what their life is like. Ask them about what their day actually looks like, because that will give you the best possible information about where you're headed. And so he thinks that it's absolutely foolish for a person to believe, no, my experience is going to be totally different in kind, or maybe in a major degree from this person who's doing exactly what I want to do. And so I don't really need to bother them with what their day is like. He's like, no, the best evidence or the best kind of proof that you could get is a person doing exactly what you want to do and them telling you, even if their experience is subjective, because of course it will be, what it's like to actually do that thing. I think that would be extremely valuable to a person considering any field.
And I will tell you also that I think if you go through that route and make that LinkedIn cold connection, a lot of times that person's going to say, it's like, yeah, I worked hard, but I was lucky, so going into the stumbling. So luck plays a role in all of these things. And I think people who've had some good luck along the way are very likely to help you out and tell you, how they played in traffic and got hit in a good way, as opposed to the other way around.
Right.
But I think that's just maybe a good starting point is be a little bit daring and put yourself out there.
Yeah, or just give yourself the space to figure out who you are.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we should expect to know exactly who we are, who we want to be at 18 or 19. I don't think that that's reasonable.
Okay.
I
was actually about to say, I feel like we kind of said our piece on the how do you enter adulthood side.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about some specific financial situations that can be problematic.
Let's move down the timeline a little bit, so to speak. So I think in this part, we want to profile a couple of cases because we're trying to expand or trying to get a range of advice for people who are in their early 20s or just starting out in their career. And if you're late to the career game, just ignore the age bracket here for a second. And then we can profile some people who might be at slightly more advanced stages in their career, somewhere where maybe you and I are. We're still in our 30s, and give some advice that might be not entirely contrarian, but something that they should be considering. So I think if you're just getting started in your career and you have the opportunity to start saving some of your disposable income, the least sexy thing we're probably going to discuss today is emergency fund. And if I was going to be frank, even as a person who was right out of college in this business of giving people advice on how to manage their money, I totally ignored, getting enough money into an adequate emergency fund. And it bit me a couple of times because as it turns out, life is random. Sometimes your transmission goes out. Sometimes somebody smashes your driver's side window so they can steal your gym bag. That happened to me. And it was $2,500 to get it fixed because it wasn't just that they smashed the window, it fell down and messed up all the gears in the door. And it's like, okay, so now this $2,500 is on a credit card and now you can get into this debt spiral. Mm-hmm. So I think if you're first starting out, and I know it's so pedestrian, but adequate emergency fund is such an asset.
Yeah. And I'd say, it doesn't have to be a specific amount or not, say the goal is 6 months of after-tax expenses, as an example. Mm-hmm. We'll start with 2 and go from there. Yeah. It doesn't have to be, well, it's not exactly what it's supposed to be, so I shouldn't even do it. I shouldn't worry about it. Start somewhere, a couple months.
Exactly.
Expenditures.
And I think with a lot of things, like the goal is pretty obvious. So you can say you might hear from a lot of people in the financial space. So 3 to 6 months of expenses in emergency fund. And then you can get this blinkered view. It's like, okay, that's the goal. I got to get 3 to 6 months of necessary expenses in this emergency fund. It's like, but let's take a second and ask ourselves, what's the goal of that goal? And that's not a metaphysical question, but the goal of that goal is you want some margin in your life.
Yeah.
You want a little bit of space between you and randomness, and it will come to you. You don't have to go looking for it. It's going to find you. And I think the illusion that I was under was, I can manage this really quickly and I'm never going to need that much money. And I've lived a fairly charmed life up to this point. And then you go out into the real world, as we kind of discussed with the previous one, and you find out things don't always cut in your direction. And sometimes they cut dramatically against you. You graduated college into a financial crisis. That's not something you could have planned for. And so having a little bit of money built up to give you just a little breathing room between what you need and what might happen to you is really the goal of that emergency.
Well, and that is, it's very similar to, you hear, I don't know exactly how true it is, but I feel like you always hear this line that, 50 or 60% of the U.S. population is, like a $2,500 or $3,000 unexpected bill away from really dire financial consequences. I think one of the other things that we've talked about a little bit is since the economy maybe got out of the COVID economy from 2020-21 is we're seeing credit card spending a lot more often, in some of the retirees that we work with, people who are in the accumulation phase. It's a lot harder to get these retirement goals kind of moving in the right direction if you're paying off even a little bit of debt that has a 16, 18, 20% interest rate. Yeah. So having that emergency fund, preventing yourself from falling into that debt spiral that you mentioned, that's a great first point.
Exactly. And I think if you are in the unfortunate position where maybe you're in the early 20s or maybe you've gotten started in your career, and in order to get your financial footing or to get your footing in this business, or maybe you moved out or what have you, and you do find yourself in consumer debt, then I think our point of view would be you want to be fairly aggressive of getting that stuff paid off. because if you are in credit card debt or really any other kind of consumer debt, the interest rates on that, you're so far behind what any other financial instrument could pay you that putting pretty much every additional dollar that you have at your expense to get that stuff paid down, that might be your first course of action, even before you have a fully fleshed out, robust emergency fund.
I would agree with you. And this could sound a little motivational speakery, but my first thought would be the solution to a debt issue is not necessarily always a spending issue. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can make more money. Yeah. Maybe you could, if you put yourself out there, and I'm not saying it has to be like a side hustle, but give yourself the credit that, you know what, I can go out and get a better job, or I can go get a raise.
Yeah, and I think that if we were deviating from this pitfall for a moment, another one would be not investing heavily in yourself and saying, the present value of just slightly more income every year over a 30-year career is dramatic. It's dramatic. So as far as when you're young and the vast majority of your financial capital, so to speak, is tied up in all of those future earnings that you have yet to receive, then just moving the rudder very minimally when you're in your 20s toward a higher paying job or toward a higher paying career path, that could definitely help you particularly with short-term debts, because a little bit more income is going to make satisfying that note way easier than trying to just whittle this thing down with, and we can appreciate how first jobs right out of school, probably not going to be your highest paying job. No. Ideally, it's not. But you're right. If you say, okay, I'm going to be working on this debt to the degree that I can, but I'm not going to ignore going out and trying to earn a higher income to help me service that debt, I think that would certainly be a mistake.
Yeah. So I think just understanding that there's two sides to this puzzle, and giving yourself the leeway to maybe take a risk on the income side to maybe help on the debt side or the expense side.
Absolutely. So we've graduated school. We have a good conception of who it is that we want to be. We feel like we're on the right career track, and now we've done the very, like I said, unsexy thing of getting an so-called adequate emergency fund in place. So maybe now we're 25, 26. We've got a few years of work under our belt. We've got a little bit more disposable income.
Yep.
And now we're really a person's coming to us and saying, hey, Scott and Greg, here's my financial situation. I could theoretically keep piling money into my 401k plan. I've also heard some things about a Roth IRA. I really just want to get some direction on what it is that I should do now that I feel like I've got some real money to save and invest for maybe something like retirement or maybe a down payment on a home that's, let's call it, more than 10 years out, something like that.
Yeah. So, and I'd say that the way that I like to think about money in that stage of life, and I like to bring this up all the time, is kind of the barbell idea, where on one side of the ledger or the barbell, you have your emergency fund. You have money that you're planning to use for a house, say in a shorter time frame than what you're talking about there. So you said 10 years. This would not be on the close part of the barbell.
That would be premature.
Yeah, that would be premature. Then you don't need a whole lot of assets in that intermediate phase. If you've got those core needs covered, if you've got your emergency fund set up, what you can do is you can start to be ambitious in looking at, hey, let's get some money into 401k plan. I like the pre-tax 401k. For a lot of people, I know that you're a pretty big fan of the Roth 401k if you have the option to do that. And then as a final note, having some money, and this is the Scott Bartosh School of Hard Knocks, as you like to describe it,
I do,
is having some after-tax money that is not necessarily just for keeping the lights on or the emergency fund. So having a little bit of money that's in that growth vehicle that is in that after-tax environment. I like that idea a lot.
Okay, let's talk about optimizing, because I know a lot of people like instructions. So if I've got several children at this point, and if they came to me and said, hey, Dad, I really wanted to figure out how I should best put my order of operations in place, because a lot of they're going through PEMDAS, as it turns out, in math class. So I remember that. Yeah. And so if you wanted to PEMDAS your savings, and we've got the adequate emergency fund in place, and now you've got a little bit of income, I think knee-jerk reaction, you and I, would be get that employer match if it's available.
If you have one.
In your 401k plan. So the Roth versus traditional, this is a very tired argument, and it really does come down to something as simple as a guess about future tax rates, and virtually nobody's guess is very good. So my claim would be, if you're at a point where you're earning a lot of money, shelter your current income from tax. If you're not earning as much money as you think you might, maybe go ahead and do the Roth option. But in any event, whatever is required, if you can get to the match, get the match. Like that's the baseline amount of money you should be putting in the 401k plan.
Yeah. And then I think just before we get into, should you max it out or should you do something else, I would say once you have the match, which is a very important first step, maybe just having a little bit of discipline to say the match is 6%.
Okay.
Next year, 7%. If it's reasonable with what's going on in the rest of your life. If you can say bump it up to 7 or 8, just try to get a little bit beyond the match in the first few years. And then, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just for the benefit of the listener, when you say 6%, like the employer is going to match 100% of the contributions you made up to 6%.
Yeah, just salary. That as an example. Okay. That might be the way that the formula. Yeah, something like 6%, or it might be 3% and then half of the next some odd percentage.
Or dollar for dollar up to some cap or what. Yeah, just whatever the matching formula is. Okay.
Yeah, and then I would say just the next stage would be thinking about, all right, can I stretch my budget a little bit further and save more?
Save a little bit more.
Yeah, save a little bit more. And then probably that next inflection point is, okay, is putting more money into the 401k preventing me from doing anything outside of the 401k?
Right. And then I feel like once you hit that sort of inflection where, and this is where we want to appreciate that this might be at slightly higher levels of income than even just the median income, depending on what your financial
probably moving up a little bit.
So maybe we've moved up toward $70,000 or $80,000 a year. You come to us and you say, I can get the employer match. I feel very comfortable getting my employer match. But I've heard some other things about maybe now switching to a Roth IRA if I'm still making the right amount of money to not be phased out, or maybe saving it in a brokerage account, and I want to explore those options. So I think our reaction would be, if you've got the flexibility to put a little bit more money away, let's explore the Roth IRA option, because the cool thing about that is there is some built-in optionality with that. It's not optimal because that is a retirement savings vehicle, and you and I would regard it as, if you put money in there, let's assume that that's going to be for your retirement. Let's not use this as an ATM if it can be avoided, adequate emergency fund being kind of primary buffer against that. However, if you put some money into a Roth IRA, you can take your contributions out, totally tax-free and totally penalty-free, even if you're not yet 59 and a half. And that's a feature that really only accrues to the Roth IRA. It's not available in the 401k. It's not available in a traditional IRA. So I kind of like exploring that for people, because in the event that they find themselves, for whatever reason, having exhausted their emergency fund, it's another kind of quasi pool of money they can get at.
Yeah, it's a different layer of savings, and it's a different category of both growth and ability to access the money now. So Roth, I agree with you. That's a great kind of intermediate after you've gotten a match on a 401k, but probably before you start to get really aggressive about, as we talked about, you could get a Fidelity account, brokerage account, and put some money into an S&P 500 fund. Just as an example, I'd probably look at the Roth first, because if you're eligible, because it has more flexibility and it has tax-free growth. That brokerage account at Fidelity with the S&P 500 fund, that's not going to have that tax deferral or tax-free growth.
Right. It's going to have other options to it. It's going to give you some other advantages, but you're correct. If you have the income that allows you to make that contribution to the Roth, and for whatever reason you ever needed it, contributions could come out. So I really like that too. And then I think the point we made slightly off air is the final stage. I think you might be a person who's beyond your 30s, where now you've got so much in terms of disposable income. You feel really comfortable with your savings rate in your 401k environment. Maybe you're even maxing that, and you still have a little bit of money left over. And now you're thinking, okay, is there a way I can defer more of my income? Should I do a non-qualified annuity? Should I do some of these other interesting vehicles out there? And I think, having referenced the Scott Bartosh School of Hard Knocks, we don't really need to get fancy with that last little bit of overage. I think a taxable brokerage account with some very efficient vehicles, hiring the right people or hiring the right things to do the right job, I think for most people that's going to be optimal at that stage of the game.
I agree with you, and I think also that fits in to the risk barbell that I was talking about before. Is once you get to that point where you're kind of graduating from today's episode, into the maybe you're in your 40s and you're really honing in on retirement savings. I think what you can probably do is, own pretty risky growth oriented stuff in that taxable brokerage account that you're talking about, because you've got the short term covered for. You've got the emergency fund. You maybe bought your first house and you've got some home equity that you could fall back on. You've got that Roth principle that you could draw on. So we're kind of graduating into further levels of safety financially.
Right. All right. So we figured out who we were. We graduated. We're doing the right things. We're trying not to get in crushing student debt. We've got our emergency fund in place, and we feel very comfortable about how it is that we're saving money. Now, I think there's a couple of other things that people might want some advice on, and I think one of the things that a lot of people can inadvertently do is tie themselves up in a very expensive housing situation.
Yeah, I was about to say that's the big one that we haven't touched on.
Right. And so I think that I don't want to necessarily get into all the particulars, because I think this can transcend just a purely math problem into the rent versus buy equation.
Yeah.
I would rather just take it from the approach of, when you're looking at the amount of money that you have at your disposal, so your take-home pay, your comfort level or how much you're going to basically give up in either allocating this money to a vehicle that's going to grow a little bit, perhaps better than it would be if you were just owning a home, plus provide you with some liquidity. And that is I think a lot of people over-index on their house, or they pay too much in rent, and it dries up their liquidity faster than they think it would.
Yeah, and I would tell you that if you think about it historically, there are places in time where buying the absolute most house that you could worked out fabulously.
Right.
Like, I'm sure if you did that in California or New York, maybe Florida at certain times, that worked out really, really nicely, where the equity just very quickly dwarfed that fact that you were maybe a little stretched on the budget, and then you sold that house and rolled hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquidity into a new house.
Right.
That perfect example. But then there's other places in California, Florida, Arizona, financial crisis, 2008 and 2009, where if you were a little bit stretched and say in a 2-income household, one person loses their job and you're very quickly in foreclosure or something like that. So I would tell you that being pretty thoughtful about how much you can do especially on that first house.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just not a lot of people who I think for their very first house in 2 or 3 years are thinking, man, I should have spent twice this. I think a lot of times people are thinking either the opposite, or, you know what, I'm really happy that I lived within my means and I kind of took a small bite at this apple, and then maybe we go into the second house that's a little bit nicer and we roll some equity into it.
Yeah, and I feel like it's kind of like if you're on a diet and you're trying to lose weight, but you're trying to do so gradually. I think a crash diet is a horrible way to go, where you're just perpetually hungry. But I think something that a lot of people can accomplish is leave a little bit of food on your plate at every meal. Just the last few bites, just leave them on your plate. And I think when you're going into if you're going to buy a home or if you're going to rent a home and you're looking at your budget, leave some margin. Don't go all the way to the edge of your housing budget right away just because you can. Because like you said, things happen. Real estate markets are wild. Job loss is a reality for a lot of people. Career change or late stage career change is a reality for a lot of people. So I think if you could allocate $3,000 to your housing expense, maybe look at something starting at $2,000 every month.
Yeah,
and think,
and
okay,
see what that gets you.
Yeah, and I think that the degree to which people will adapt to their environment is sort of a double-edged sword, because if you get the fanciest house that you can buy, I assure you, after a few months, it's just going to be where you live. It's the same thing with a car. And this is not to dissuade anybody from having nice things. I think that there's a lot of utility in that. But I think that you will adapt to your environment. But the same could be said about a house that maybe at first blush you thought, oh, we might be a little cramped, and maybe in a couple of years we want to start a family, and I don't know how that's going to work. Where would the nursery go? These are all totally valid things that we could appreciate a person might be concerned with. But from our perspective, I think we see the mistake being made in guys, I got too much house. I am cash poor. I've got no cash flow because it seems like every time I get a paycheck, it goes directly to my mortgage or directly to my rent. And I just don't have the money to do some of the things that we actually want to do, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's the more likely scenario. And as a final thought on maybe the cautionary side of this, I would also encourage you, if say you're in your 20s or 30s and you're buying that first house, you have equity in that house. But I would not think of that as an investment.
Right.
I think when you start to think of the money in your house as an investment, one, it can lead you to stretch a little bit more because you're thinking, okay, I'm going to get a return out of this house, so therefore I can stretch a little bit further. Not a great idea, in my opinion. And two, I think what it does is it leads you to not consider the maintenance and the taxes and the insurance as maybe something that's pulling against that equity amount that you have or that investment in your house. I would really think of the house as an expense as best you can. And then in the future, if you pull some money out of it, that's great. You know, it's if you get some equity out of the house in the long run, wonderful. But there's expenses along the way that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think because we had just counseled some people on this not too long ago, where it's like the immediate costs of acquiring a home are significant and salient. So it's like you kind of pretty much know what your earnest money is going to be, what your down payment's going to be. You might have a loose idea of what the taxes are going to be annually and the insurance costs are going to be. But I think what people lose sight of, particularly right at initiation, is there's a lot of random stuff that comes up in the event of a move.
Yeah.
And also, I kind of like to think of it as if you get a house that's twice as nice, the maintenance costs are square of that. So it's like you get a double the nice house, 4 times the maintenance cost is generally what it means for a person. Now, that might be a slight over-exaggeration, but it's kind of it's a more conservative approach.
Yeah, and I mean, also another one to consider is you buy a nicer, bigger house. Do you have all the furniture to fill said house? I mean, you're probably signing yourself up for at minimum a long trip to IKEA.
Yes. Is it in any trip to IKEA not long?
Yeah. Well, I think they've got those like half stores in a couple places where it's just like they have everything in one aisle. You walk through it and you're done, but not in Houston.
That would be nice. Okay. I like that discussion there. There was one that I felt like we could get into that is less like here's what you should be doing, and it's a little bit more of a softer approach maybe. Okay. And this is budgeting perfectionism. Because I feel like you get the people in the Ramsey camp with the every dollar, and you got to give every dollar a job, and if it doesn't fit in the envelope, you can't spend it. And then I think on the other side of that is just you get people who are in credit card debt and they're clearly lacking discipline. And weirdly enough, one of the things I'm going to talk about, one of the ways that people can kind of view their money is a combination of Elizabeth Warren, who actually wrote about this, and then the George Costanza method, which is opposite. So I feel like Elizabeth Warren popularized the 50-30-20 method. So 50% of your income is essentially on all of your necessities. That would be housing, food, gas, groceries, whatever. 30% of your income is on other kind of things that you want, and 20% of your income is on saving for the long term. Okay, and that I feel like is a really basic framework. And again, popularized by Senator Elizabeth Warren. This was way back in her days when she was writing interesting books like The Two-Income Trap, as an example. And I think that is a little bit more of an approachable way of allocating money because it removes this dire need to track every single transaction and instead just make sure that, you know, your core expenses aren't exceeding 50% of your income to the degree that you can control that. Mm-hmm. And if you've just reserved 20% for long-term savings, I think it gives type A people permission to kind of allocate that remaining 30% however it is they want to allocate it.
Yeah, and I think that whether it's in, say a marriage, say you've got 2 incomes or 1 income in a joint account, having flexibility and some freedom to spend a little bit of money on yourself. It's super important.
Exactly.
Whether you're married or single, whether it's 30% or 25%, whatever the number is, just having some ability to do something fun because you want to, it's important.
Yeah, and that was the George Costanza element was some people might say you need to give every single dollar a name. Every dollar's got to have a job. George Costanza was like, I'm going to do the opposite of that. And so not by I'm just going to spend freely, but rather than doing that, I'm going to purposefully construct my budget so that a portion of it doesn't have a name. so that I can come up with the name whenever I want to, however it is I want to. I could be charitable with it. I could buy myself some new shoes. I could do whatever I want. And I think for people who are very type A, where they can get into this like over allocating, constantly optimizing. We have a couple of clients like this, by the way.
Do we?
Over allocating, constantly optimizing trap, where now all of a sudden they have this anxiety that claws at their chest because they feel like, oh, I blew some money and did something fun. Whereas I could have put a little bit more in my 401k. I could have put a little bit more here. I could have been done. It's like, give yourself breathing room to just have some money that comes in every month. And it's going to start small, obviously, but it's going to grow over time to where you don't have to agonize about how this money should be allocated. It can just go any way it wants to go.
Yeah. And as a final thought on that, every once in a while, we'll look at a retirement case where you get to retirement, age 60 or 62, whenever it is, and it is just right on that knife's edge where like, it could kind of go either way, and a few dollars here or there on the budget maybe is going to have some impact. The vast majority of them, you get to retirement and there's a margin of safety, whether it's because your spending is really disciplined or your saving has been really disciplined. One of those two things probably starts to outshine your expenditures, whatever it might be, in the long run, and we find a way to make it work.
Yeah. So it's like, to the degree that you can, set your savings and investing in a way that you set it and forget it. Your core expenditures are what they are. You need to approach those with a little bit of a discipline, saying, not going to get in crushing student loan debt. I'm going to get the right dollars in the right vehicle. I'm not going to over-index on my house. But then again, it's like, the purpose of making money, the purpose of this life is to enjoy it, I think. And at some time or another, you have to allow yourself to enjoy your money. You do. And sometimes you have to have conversations with clients basically forcing them to do that. But if you are disciplined, like you mentioned, you can enjoy your money and you can later enjoy your retirement. It's totally doable.
And as a very final thought, I would say, if you just really don't know if you can do something or not, call somebody like myself or Greg.
Exactly.
And we'll walk you through it.
Shameless plug right here. Here we go.
This broadcast contains the current opinions of the hosts and are subject to change. The broadcast is provided for informational purposes only and should not be considered investment advice or recommendations. Investors should obtain professional advice before making investment decisions. This is not a complete analysis of every material fact regarding any company, industry, or security. The information has been obtained from sources we consider to be reliable but cannot guarantee their accuracy. Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated is not a legal or tax services provider, and you are strongly encouraged to seek the advice of the appropriate professional advisors before taking any action. For more information about any companies discussed, please contact Baird. Past performance is not indicative of future results, and diversification does not ensure a profit or protect against loss. All investments carry some level of risk, including loss of principal. An investment cannot be made directly in an index. The broadcast may not be reproduced without express permission of Robert W. Baird & Co. Incorporated.